It wasn't the heat that woke me that morning, it was the sound of running water. At first, I thought it was just the old irrigation timer kicking in early. But when I stepped outside in my robe and slippers, half awake and fully annoyed, I found a thick green hose slithering like a snake under my back fence, dragging every last drop from my water tank like it had been thirsty for years. I followed it with my eyes, dazed, until they landed on Karen, drenched in sunlight and entitlement, watering her marigolds like she was baptizing them with holy water. She waved at me like nothing was wrong. That's when I realized something was very, very wrong. For the past 2 weeks, the water pressure on my property had been unpredictable. Some mornings I'd turn on the tap, and it would spit like an old man with chewing tobacco. Other times, the livestock troughs would fill at half the usual rate, and the pump would make a noise like it was gasping for air. I chalked it up to summer strain. Maybe the lines needed flushing or the solar backup wasn't storing enough juice. I ran tests, checked valves, even called in my nephew, who used to be a plumber before he found out video game streaming paid better. Nothing added up. But seeing that hose snaking out of my land changed everything. It was too long, too thick, and definitely too familiar. I recognized it as the same industrial-grade kind used for high-flow garden pump. I stood there barefoot on the dirt, arms crossed, as the realization boiled under my skin like a kettle about to scream. She was stealing my water. Karen was head of the HOA board, a title she treated like royalty. She had rules for everyone. Trash bins must be pulled in by 6 p.m. Lawns must be evenly cut, hedges must not exceed 36 inches, and children must not use chalk on the sidewalk. But when it came to her rules were more like suggestions, and her suggestions were more like sermons. Her lawn was the greenest in the whole neighborhood. Her garden glowed like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. And her sprinklers, well, they ran like Niagara Falls. I walked the fence line later that afternoon. I didn't say a word. I didn't knock on her door or yell over the gate. I just traced the path of the hose, noting how it fed through a hole in the fence, one that wasn't there a month ago. The flow was steady, no kinks, no break. It was a direct siphon. She wasn't just borrowing a cup of water here and there. No. This was theft in gallons. The next morning, I decided to do what any man with a mild case of paranoia and a lifetime of rural experience would do. I set a trap. I fixed a trail camera on the tree nearest the fence. It was hidden inside a birdhouse I had hollowed out years ago for exactly this kind of nonsense. A motion sensor would activate it any time someone came near the valve junction. That night, it lit up like a Christmas tree. The footage showed her handyman, some poor guy with more sweat than sense, crawling through her backyard with what looked like a pipe wrench and a small flashlight in his mouth. He disconnected a pressure lock I didn't even know was still accessible from the outside. Then he opened a valve, attached a T-splitter, and reinforced the hose that ran directly back to her garden. When I zoomed in on the timestamp, it confirmed what I feared. This setup had been going on for at least 10 nights straight. Every time I was asleep or away at town hall meetings, she was running her own private waterworks operation off my back. I confronted her the next afternoon with a calm smile and a flash drive. She opened the door like I had interrupted a tea party, even though her hair was frazzled, and she had a garden hose in one hand like a weapon disguised as a tool. I told her politely that I'd noticed a hose crossing the property line and that I'd appreciate if she stopped. She laughed, actually laughed, like I'd told her my tomatoes were running for mayor. Said it must be some weird neighborhood plumbing quirk, and that I should take it up with the HOA. That's when it got interesting. The next morning I received an email from the HOA fining me for unauthorized accusations and causing unrest within the neighborhood. Karen had weaponized the rules, twisted them like she did everything else. But now it wasn't just petty drama. Now it was personal. They wanted to paint me as the cranky old man losing his marbles. But I knew what I saw, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I went down to the local hardware store and picked up a couple of items that might seem unrelated to anyone else. A high-pressure cutoff valve, a new pressure regulator, and a hand-painted wooden sign that read "Private Property, Water Supply Monitored." Then I called in an old friend from the county utilities office. He owed me a favor from back when I helped fix his barn roof during a windstorm. I asked him a simple question: who really owns the utility line running beneath our lots? He pulled up the files. Turns out, during a water shortage 15 years ago, I had agreed to let my personal well system act as an emergency overflow for the HOA line, only with written permission and maintenance contracts. And those had expired 6 years ago. I hung up the phone, heart racing, not with panic but satisfaction. It wasn't just my water tank anymore. The line Karen had illegally tapped into? It was the same one that quietly fed half the street during high-usage hours. In her greed, she hadn't just stolen from me. She had siphoned from her own supporters, all the while blaming city plumbing, climate change, and everyone but herself. She had no idea the valve she'd tapped was the throat of the system. If I turned it, I wouldn't just be cutting off her marigolds. I'd be shutting down water for half the HOA. And that, I decided, was exactly what I'd do. The morning after discovering that Karen's hose had been sucking water from my tank like a leech, I brewed a stronger pot of coffee than usual and stood by the window, watching the sun climb over the ridge. It was calm out there. Too calm. Birds chirped like nothing was wrong, the breeze stirred the leaves gently, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint hiss of sprinklers. Karen's sprinklers. Still running. Still lush. Still alive. Meanwhile, my animals were drinking with rationed pails, and I was brushing my teeth with bottled water like I was camping in my own house. I sat at my kitchen table and laid out everything I had so far. The footage from the trail cam. The expired HOA water agreement. The pressure log readings showing spikes and drops every time her system kicked in. But even with all this evidence, something kept bothering me. If she was pulling water from my tank, where was it all going? Her garden was green, sure, but it wasn't a golf course. Then I remembered the new homes on the far end of the street. They'd all had water issues last summer. Karen had personally promised those neighbors better pressure this year. Could she have rerouted my supply to feed not just her own house, but multiple homes? Curiosity turned into obsession. I walked the property line again, then took the long way around through the wooded path between lots. I noticed it quickly this time. A secondary hose, branching off the first, snaking across yards like a covert pipeline. It ran beneath decorative rocks, behind shrubs, even through a drain culvert disguised as landscaping. Each time I traced it further, it led to another sprinkler head or hose bib that didn't belong to Karen's property. At least 4 other houses. All of them part of the HOA. All of them managed by her little fiefdom. It made perfect sense now. Karen had created her own private utility empire using my water. And she wasn't just stealing for herself. She was running a racket. I overheard one of the neighbors praising her at the mailbox later that day. Said she was a hero for fixing the pressure problem. Another neighbor even mentioned paying her a small monthly fee for access to the improved irrigation. My jaw tightened. She was charging people for stolen water, and they didn't even know it. That night I called Roy. Roy had worked at the county water office for 20 years and owed me more than a few favors. I told him everything. The old agreements, the suspicious rerouting, the photos, the video footage. He whistled low on the other end of the line, then said he'd come by the next day with a pressure diagnostic kit and a few legal printouts that might come in handy. If the HOA was tied to my old easement, and that easement had legally expired, then they were trespassing every time they turned on a faucet. While waiting for Roy, I started making preparations. I didn't want to cut off the water just yet. That would cause a panic and tip my hand too early. Instead, I installed a hidden flow restrictor deep inside the pipe junction. It would limit the volume of water without fully shutting things down. The result was subtle but immediate. Karen's precious green lawn started showing signs of yellow. Her hydrangeas drooped a little. Her fountain slowed to a dribble. And as expected, her attitude began to sour. By the fourth day, I heard yelling from her yard. She was on the phone, barking at someone about the water pressure being unacceptable and sabotaged. I smiled quietly as I sipped my tea. Then, as if on cue, I received another letter from the HOA. This one accused me of disrupting the community water balance, of hoarding resources, and of intentionally interfering with neighborhood beautification efforts. I read the letter twice, then a third time. It was so full of nonsense, it could have been written by a malfunctioning typewriter. They gave me 7 days to resolve the pressure disparity, or face a fine. I made copies of everything. The letters, the footage, the property records. I organized them into a neat folder labeled evidence. Roy showed up 2 days later in his county-issued pickup, wearing mirrored sunglasses and sipping a gas station coffee. He took one look at the valve setup and whistled again. "You weren't kidding," he said. "She's tapped into your overflow pipe and your emergency pressure valve. That's not just illegal. That's reckless. If the pump hiccups or fails, the whole system could backfeed and flood the junction box." I asked him if it could be shut off without damaging the system. He nodded and pulled out a toolkit. We worked quietly for an hour. He installed a second shutoff valve on my end of the tank, one that I could lock with a simple padlock. Then we added a pressure monitor with a digital log so I could track the flow in real time. I also had him install a remote sensor that would alert my phone every time the flow spiked. It wasn't just about protecting my water anymore. It was about building a case. The next day, I dressed like any other morning. Jeans, boots, and my old straw hat. I walked to the mailbox just in time to catch Karen loading her SUV with bags of mulch. She looked flustered, sweaty, and downright angry. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me. "Having some trouble with your garden?" I asked innocently. She squinted at me. "The city says there's an issue with the grid. Something about an unexpected slowdown in supply." I just nodded. "That's a shame. You should really keep an eye on your hoses. They can cause backflow if connected improperly." She said nothing, just slammed the car door and drove off. That evening, I received a phone call. It was from one of the neighbors who had unknowingly benefited from the siphon. He sounded confused. Said his sprinklers had gone dry and that Karen told him the city was investigating sabotage. I asked if he had ever signed anything allowing her to install irrigation across property lines. He said no. I told him the truth. Not in anger. Just calm, clear facts. Within hours, the neighborhood buzzed with murmurs. People started asking questions. The praise she once soaked in like sunlight began to dry up. I knew it was only a matter of time now. Karen had built her throne out of my water. But the base was crumbling. And when it gave out, it wouldn't just be her flowers that withered. It would be the whole illusion she'd wrapped around this place like ivy. All I had to do was wait. And watch. 3 days after Roy helped me install the shutoff valve and digital pressure monitor, I was sitting on my porch just before sunrise, watching the mist rise off the pasture, when my phone buzzed. The alert was short and sharp. Water surge detected. I opened the app and saw it, a pressure spike so strong it nearly doubled the usual output. Someone was trying to force open the system. My heart didn't race. It slowed. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked inside. Time to see who thought they could outmaneuver me in my own backyard. I followed the gravel path around the barn and stopped by the valve junction. The lock I'd installed was still there, but the pipe above it was damp. Not leaking, not broken. Just damp, like someone had touched it with sweaty hands or had sprayed water to test for weakness. Then I saw it, tiny scratch marks on the metal. Fresh ones. As if someone had tried to twist it with a wrench, but didn't know what they were doing. I reached for my trail cam footage from the night before and queued it up. There she was. Karen. Wearing black leggings and a hoodie like she thought she was in some neighborhood spy movie, tiptoeing through the shadows with a flashlight between her teeth and a metal tool in hand. She tried the valve. Tried to twist the line. Then got spooked by a raccoon and stumbled back into her garden fence. I watched it all with a mix of disbelief and amusement. The queen of the HOA, reduced to sneaking into my yard like a petty thief. I knew this was the moment to act. Not out of spite, not yet. This wasn't about revenge. This was about leverage. I saved the footage and copied it to a separate drive, just in case. Then I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. Explained the situation, calmly and without embellishment. They said they'd send a deputy to take a report. That same afternoon, Deputy Harris pulled into my driveway. He was young, polite, and looked like he still believed people were mostly good. I showed him the footage, the scratched pipe, the documents from Roy, the HOA letters, everything. He nodded slowly as he pieced it together. When I told him that Karen had used my private system to supply multiple homes, his eyes widened. That's a serious matter, he said. Tampering with utility lines, especially without a permit or contract, is no joke. He took photos, filed an official incident report, and said they'd be following up. I thanked him and walked him back to his car. As he was leaving, he said one thing that stuck with me. You're being smart about this. Most folks would have gone straight for the shutoff. But you're letting her dig her own hole. That's rare. The next day, the water cut fully. Not from my end. From hers. The restrictor valve had finally slowed her illegal feed to the point where it couldn't sustain the 4 homes she had been quietly servicing. I knew it was coming. That evening, as if choreographed, the calls began. First from Mr. Benson 2 doors down. Then the Patel family. Then the newlyweds in Lot 16. They all said the same thing. Karen promised improved water service. Karen had said she handled it. Karen told them to pay her, not the HOA. One neighbor even said he handed her a cash envelope each month, thinking it went to the water company. I asked them all the same question. Did you sign anything? Did you agree to reroute water from my property? No. They hadn't. None of them had any idea where the water was coming from. They thought Karen had pulled strings with the county or paid for a private well herself. She had fooled them all. And now they were angry. Not just because their water was gone, but because they'd been lied to. Used. Taken for fools. I kept a low profile that day, working in my barn and pretending not to notice the growing commotion. By evening, Karen came storming down my driveway like a dust devil wrapped in polyester. She didn't knock. Just started yelling from the gate. You sabotaged the neighborhood. You're creating a drought. Do you have any idea what you've done? I stayed calm. Asked her if she'd like to discuss it civilly. She refused. Screamed something about lawsuits and city ordinances. I told her to leave before I called the sheriff again. She turned bright red, kicked the bottom rail of my fence, and marched back up the street. That night, I opened a cold bottle of root beer and watched the footage again. This time I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was finally unraveling. Her empire, built on deception and borrowed pipes, was crumbling. The next morning, I received a notice in my mailbox from the HOA board. It was not a fine. It was an invitation. They were calling an emergency meeting, citing water irregularities and neighborhood unrest. I knew then the tide had shifted. Karen was no longer in control. At the meeting, she tried to maintain her grip. She walked in wearing a bright red blazer and fake confidence. She carried a stack of printed papers and began a long speech about community responsibility and sabotage. But she didn't count on the rest of the board being just as fed up as the residents. I waited until she was done. Then I stood, walked to the front, and opened a folder. I laid out everything. The photos, the diagrams, the footage of the hose, the late-night tampering, the records of expired easement contracts. I explained how the shared water line had legally reverted back to private status years ago. Then I played the clip. Karen, caught red-handed, twisting my valve in the dead of night. The room fell silent. Someone gasped. Another neighbor let out a low whistle. Karen turned white, then red, then white again. She tried to speak, but the board chair cut her off. He asked me one question. Can you prove all this is true? I said yes. Roy had signed the documentation himself. He handed me the certified county documents just before the meeting. I presented them to the board. The chair nodded, then turned to Karen and asked if she had anything to add. She stammered, lied, denied. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming. The board voted, right then and there, to remove her from her leadership position pending investigation. Someone else would be stepping in to lead while the matter was reviewed. Karen stormed out without a word. Her supporters followed, quiet and ashamed. The rest of the room turned to me. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap. But they nodded. Respect. Recognition. Gratitude in its quietest form. I nodded back. No smugness. Just relief. As I walked back home under the evening sky, I passed her house. The lawn was yellowing now. Her prized flower beds were withering. The fountain had stopped completely. She stood at the window, arms folded, watching me walk past. But this time, she said nothing. And for once, neither did I. The days that followed the HOA meeting were quiet, but not peaceful. There was a tension in the air that hummed beneath the surface like the pressure in an overfilled tank. Karen's house sat like a wounded beast on the corner of the street, no longer the center of attention, but the center of suspicion. Her lawn had faded into a brittle patchwork of dry yellow, and the once immaculate flower beds that had won her neighborhood awards were now drooping, thirsty, and forgotten. People passed by with curious glances, some whispering, others simply walking faster. She no longer waved. She no longer smiled. She just watched. Inside my own house, I finally exhaled. For the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up to water pressure alerts or HOA threat. I moved through my chores without wondering who was sneaking around my pipe. But even in that calm, I knew it wasn't over. The board had only removed her from her post temporarily. There was still a process, still protocols, still paperwork. If I wanted closure, I needed something more concrete. Something permanent. That's when I decided to dig into the legal roots of the water system itself. I spent a full afternoon at the county records office. It smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of place where secrets waited in manila folders and forgotten filing cabinet. I brought the easement contracts from Roy and asked for every map, survey, and utility addendum related to the neighborhood. The clerk was slow but thorough. After 2 hours, she returned with a stack of documents thick enough to choke a goat. I sat at a public desk and sifted through them one by one. What I found was even better than I hoped. 15 years ago, during the Great Drought, the HOA board at the time, long before Karen's reign, had petitioned to use a private well located on the edge of what was then my grandfather's land. My grandfather had agreed to provide emergency overflow access for the sake of the neighborhood, with 2 conditions. First, the HOA would be responsible for maintenance and repairs on any shared line segment. Second, the contract would expire automatically after 10 years unless renewed in writing. I checked the files again. No renewal. No new contract. The line, as far as the law was concerned, belonged to me. Solely. Fully. Irrevocably. That realization hit me with a strange weight. I wasn't just the guy Karen had stolen from. I wasn't just a neighbor with a grudge. I was now, officially, the man who controlled the water supply to half the neighborhood. The irony was sharp and sweet. The woman who had used my water to build her image had no idea that the tap she drank from belonged to me in every way that mattered. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store and bought a new sign. I had it custom made to match the wood grain of my fence. I asked them to carve the words with thick black paint so they'd be readable from the street. By the time the sun set, I had it posted right next to the valve box. Private water supply. Access by permission only. HOA use prohibited without contract. I didn't need to knock on doors or send letters. That sign did the talking for me. The next morning, I opened my window and sipped coffee as I watched Karen walk her little dog past the fence. She slowed when she saw the sign, stared at it like it was a snake, then glanced toward my house. Our eyes met. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just stood there, calm as stone, watching her confront the truth. She looked away first. Later that week, a man in a polo shirt and khakis showed up at my door. Said he was a contractor working on behalf of the HOA. He had a clipboard full of jargon and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked if I would consider negotiating a new shared access agreement. I told him I'd consider it if the HOA wrote a public apology, refunded the funds Karen had collected, and agreed to pay a premium rate based on current water market costs. He chuckled. I didn't. I told him the rate would triple if they tried to pressure me again. He left quietly. Word spread fast. I didn't need to gloat. The neighborhood began to shift. People who once praised Karen began to distance themselves. Some came to me privately, embarrassed and apologetic, asking if they could pay for access directly. I told them I wasn't in the water business, not unless the HOA came clean and made it right. A few of them nodded. A few even signed a petition requesting Karen's permanent removal from the board. Then came the local reporter. She had heard about the strange story of a suburban water war and wanted an interview. I agreed on one condition. No exaggeration. No drama. Just facts. We sat in my backyard, the camera pointed toward the tanks and the wildflowers I'd planted as part of my grandfather's old irrigation tradition. I told her everything. The theft, the evidence, the HOA's silence, and the truth about who the water had always belonged to. The story ran the next week under the title The Man Who Owned the Water. It wasn't sensational, but it was honest. Karen didn't show her face for 3 days. When she finally did, she looked smaller somehow. Like the weight of her own ego had collapsed inward. She no longer walked her dog past my fence. No longer barked orders at the gardeners. She simply faded into the background, where her hoses had once slithered. The board met again 2 weeks later. This time, it wasn't an emergency meeting. It was a vote. The petition had gained traction. The residents wanted a full investigation into Karen's past decisions, including misuse of funds and unauthorized utility modifications. The vote passed. She was out. Not suspended. Not reviewed. Removed. I got the letter 2 days later. It wasn't from her. It was from the new acting board chair. It thanked me for my patience, my cooperation, and my willingness to protect the community in the face of personal loss. It also included a request. Would I consider allowing water access again, this time through a formal contract with fair compensation and oversight? I read the letter slowly, then folded it and placed it on the table. I wasn't ready to answer just yet. Not because I was holding a grudge, but because power, once taken, needed to be held carefully. Not like a sword. Like a scale. I wasn't Karen. I wasn't interested in ruling. I just wanted peace. And I finally had it. It was a strange feeling waking up to calm after so many weeks of tension. The early morning sounds of birds and wind through the trees no longer felt like a cover for conflict. The alerts from my water pressure monitor were steady, quiet, and uneventful. No surges. No siphoning. No unauthorized activity. I walked out to the yard with my coffee, boots crunching softly in the gravel, and stood by the tank. The valves gleamed under the sun, undisturbed and properly sealed. The custom wooden sign stood firm, not a scratch on it. I exhaled, letting the warmth of the moment settle into my shoulders. I had finally reclaimed what was mine. But in the calm, a new thought had begun to form. I had won the battle, but what came next? The HOA had formally removed Karen. The neighborhood had turned, the board had apologized, and the rogue lines feeding off my tank had all been capped. But the infrastructure remained. My tank still sat at the heart of a utility system that had once served others. And the people, my neighbors, still needed water. They were not to blame for Karen's schemes. Most of them had no idea what was happening, and those who did were beginning to make things right. That realization made something shift inside me. I had all the power now, but the question was how I would use it. I spent the next few days speaking to individual neighbors. Not from a place of authority, but with quiet curiosity. I asked them how things had been. If they had managed without the unauthorized water supply. If they had plans to install their own systems or petition the city for support. A few mentioned rain barrels, others considered drilling shallow wells, and some were just waiting to see what the HOA would offer next. It became clear that while Karen had built her scheme on lies, it was rooted in a real problem. The neighborhood needed more water than the aging infrastructure could provide. That's when the idea came. Not revenge. Not control. A solution. A formal water-sharing agreement that would operate with transparency, fairness, and legal documentation. One where my property remained mine, but where surplus water could be sold or shared in a controlled way, with checks, balances, and proper compensation. I didn't want to become a water baron. I just wanted peace and sustainability. And maybe, just maybe, a little justice for the headaches I had endured. I drafted a simple proposal and sent it to the interim HOA board. It outlined 3 key things. First, that any use of my water would require a signed contract and monthly report. Second, that I would retain the right to cut access at any time for abuse or non-payment. And third, that a portion of the collected fees would go toward improving the community's overall water systems. Rain tanks, filters, drip irrigation kits, and even xeriscaping projects to reduce water dependency. The board took a week to respond. They invited me to a meeting, not at the clubhouse, but on my property. Around my tank. A symbolic gesture, and an appreciated one. The meeting was small. Just the board members, a few residents, and the new chairwoman, a retired school principal named Gloria, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone except me. She asked thoughtful questions, took notes, listened more than she spoke. When I finished my explanation, she nodded. "This is fair," she said. "More than fair." She turned to the others, and one by one, they agreed. The HOA would sign. It would be temporary at first, with a trial period of 6 months. But it would be legal, official, and mutual. For the first time since the mess began, we were no longer pointing fingers. We were building something. The agreement was signed the following week. A licensed plumber came out to install a flow meter with dual recording. Every gallon used would be logged both on my system and theirs. I would receive automatic alerts, and a third-party inspection would verify the readings monthly. Payment would be direct deposit, and the funds would be split according to the agreement. I even had a say in how the community portion was used. I requested that part of it fund a small community garden, one that used recycled water and native plants. Not a vanity project, but something useful, something sustainable. The reaction from the neighborhood surprised me. People stopped by to thank me. Not just for the water, but for not letting it become personal. For not turning it into a grudge match. A few dropped off cookies and pies. One elderly man brought a tin of homemade fudge. A young couple offered to help mend the back fence that had been damaged by Karen's earlier escapade. The tone had shifted. The air felt lighter. But the biggest shift came one morning when I was trimming the wildflower patch by the fence and saw Karen walking slowly down the street. Her posture was different. Shoulders hunched. Eyes downcast. She looked older, not in years, but in spirit. Her dog padded beside her without the usual bounce. She hesitated at the edge of my property, glanced at the sign, then looked toward me. I didn't move. Just waited. She took a breath and approached. "I came to apologize," she said quietly. "I know I went too far. I was wrong. About the water. About the board. About you." Her voice cracked slightly. I didn't respond right away. Not out of malice, but because I needed a moment. Finally, I nodded. "It's not about me anymore," I said. "It's about fixing what's broken." She nodded too, eyes still low. Then turned and walked away. I didn't tell anyone about that conversation. It didn't need to be part of the story. The real story was what came next. The garden was planted. The community water lines stabilized. The HOA held new elections and introduced transparency rules. Gloria was voted in permanently. Monthly newsletters replaced passive-aggressive flyers, and the water flowed, clear, fair, and monitored. I added one last sign next to the tank, smaller than the first. It said shared with permission. A reminder that cooperation always works better than theft. I didn't need revenge anymore. I had something better. I had control, peace, and a community that was learning to stand on level ground again. And in a neighborhood once ruled by noise and control, that silence was the sweetest sound of all. The summer rolled in fully by the time the community garden took shape. The soil was tilled by hand, the beds were raised with donated lumber, and seeds arrived in envelopes marked with names like heirloom tomatoes and prairie sunflowers. Neighbors came out one by one to help plant, water, and arrange. I stood back more often than not, watching them take ownership of it. The same people who once lined up behind Karen's every decision were now kneeling in the dirt, side by side, sharing tips and swapping stories. No one mentioned the past anymore, not directly. But it lingered in the way people spoke more gently, paused more thoughtfully, and offered help without being asked. It was in that calm that a new letter came to my mailbox. Not a complaint, not a threat, but an official offer from the county. Someone from the Water Conservation Department had read the local article and forwarded it to their director. They were interested in my setup. The self-contained solar-powered tank, the underground recovery system, and the efficient flow management I had developed. They asked if I would consider allowing limited access during peak drought seasons, with compensation and oversight. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. Not because I was unsure about the answer, but because I wanted to think carefully before taking the next step. That evening I walked the property alone. Past the tank, past the now-locked valve box, through the trail that once held Karen's hidden hose. The woods were quiet, dappled in golden light. I paused by the old fence line and ran my hand along the new boards where it had once been cut. Everything had been patched, replaced, restored. But the memory of that hose slithering beneath the wood still lingered. It was more than theft. It was a symbol of what happens when people forget the boundaries between what's theirs and what isn't. Still, I wasn't bitter. The town had changed. The neighborhood had learned. And I had grown in ways I hadn't expected. The next morning, I called the county office and spoke to the director directly. She was practical, courteous, and understood rural systems better than most. I explained the limits of my setup, the volume it could sustain, and the conditions I would require. I wasn't interested in running a business, but if the county needed help during emergencies, I would be open to cooperation. She appreciated the offer and promised that anything involving my land would be on my terms. We agreed to a formal contract review within the month. It was a small agreement, but symbolically it meant everything. For the first time, the man with the tank was no longer being stolen from or sabotaged. He was being respected. A week later, the HOA held its first open vote on community resource management. It wasn't about water this time. It was about long-term planning, emergency response, and land use. I was asked to speak at the gathering, not as a property owner with a grudge, but as someone who had experienced the sharp end of mismanagement and still chose to help. I didn't prepare a speech. I just spoke from the heart. I talked about how easy it was to let control turn into selfishness, and how even good intentions can get lost when no one checks the power that comes with leadership. I reminded them that resources like water don't just belong to whoever grabs the valve first. They belong to the future. People listened. Not because I demanded it, but because they were ready. When the vote passed, it included provisions for transparency, public access to board decisions, and rotating committee seat. There would never be another Karen, not because people would stop being difficult, but because the system was no longer built to serve one person at the expense of the rest. I saw her that night, standing across the street, watching from her porch. She didn't come over, and I didn't wave. But there was no malice in the way we looked at each other. Just quiet understanding. She knew what she lost. I knew what I had reclaimed. As fall approached, the first harvest from the garden came in. Peppers, squash, cucumbers. The kids painted signs for each row, and someone built a small bench from reclaimed wood where people could sit and rest. The board installed a water-efficient irrigation system fed by the overflow from my tank. Nothing was wasted now. Every drop had purpose. The sound of sprinklers no longer meant theft. It meant growth, renewal. I walked past the garden each morning on my way to check the animals, and I always paused. Not for long. Just long enough to breathe it in. One Saturday, as I was cleaning out the barn, Gloria stopped by with a clipboard and a small package. She handed me a certificate signed by the county and the HOA board, officially recognizing my contribution to water sustainability and community cooperation. I thanked her and told her it wasn't necessary. She smiled and said it wasn't about recognition. It was about setting a record straight. The second thing she handed me was a small wooden plaque. It had my name carved at the top, and below it 4 words. Steward of the Source. I held it in my hands for a moment longer than I meant to. That night I mounted it beside the tank. Not to boast, but to remind anyone who passed by that the source of anything valuable must be respected. That night the wind was soft. The air smelled like pine and hay and earth. I sat outside under the stars and listened to the stillness that had once been pierced by Karen's yelling and the rattle of hoses. Now it was quiet, full of peace and the promise of a new season. The water flowed. Not stolen. Not hidden. Not hoarded. It flowed because it was shared with care. And in that flow, the neighborhood had found something rare. Not just balance but dignity. Not just rules but trust. And I, once just a quiet man with a tank at the edge of town, had become the unlikely keeper of that trust. Not because I wanted the role, but because I had earned it. Drop by drop, fence by fence, day by day. And as the lights flickered off one by one across the neighborhood, I realized something else. In the end, it had never really been about water. It had been about boundaries. About standing firm when others crossed them. About knowing when to fight, when to forgive, and when to turn something broken into something better. And that, I thought, as I leaned back in my old porch chair, was worth every ounce of the trouble it took to get here.